All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to an hopefully the start of a long series. I decided to change up what I was going to do. I was going to talk about how to campaign, how to effectively run a campaign, but then I thought, yeah, that might be a little. I don't know. I just decided I wanted to change it up a little bit. I wanted to talk about kind of the history of how campaigns have evolved because the reality is, I think a lot of people uh, think that campaigning has always been like it is today, where you have very high tech operations, where you have um, a significant ground game, where you have major rallies at one location, um, and stuff like that. Give a lot of speeches as a candidate and all that stuff, but the reality is, it wasn't always like that. And to start off with, we're going to talk about the first real presidential election campaign here in the United States. And that was 1796, where you had John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. And to put it lightly, uh, Adams won. But let's talk about how their campaigns operated. And both were using the exact same tactics, which was primarily the candidate didn't actually run themselves. They stayed at home for the most part, or almost completely. And they let others campaign for them. And this is what was known as, and still is known as, surrogates. These would be prominent politicians from that state or that city campaigning on your behalf. In addition, you would also have, newspapers. Newspaper endorsements were a big deal back then. And of course, you had very few that were truly independent newspapers. And the vast majority had a partisan lean to it, a partisan slant or bend. And you would often hear attacks. And in the election of 1800, you had some very vicious ones between both Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson, one newspaper that endorsed Jefferson said that Adams had a hermaphroditical quality. I can't even. I know the quote by heart, but it's hard to say with a straight face because it's so funny. It said that Adams had a hermaphroditical quality that had neither the softness or gentleness of a woman nor the firmness of a man. You can't make that stuff up. Of course, Adams' newspapers said that Jefferson was a radical Jacobin, and one even said that he was a half breed, which at the time was a derogatory slang term for anyone who was not 100% white. The son of a half breed with an Indian squaw woman and a mulatto father. I mean, they went hard. Now, of course, we shouldn't be talking like that or even using those types of racial attacks because, well, come on. That's just below anyone of any sort of character. But it shows but it shows just how vicious these campaigns were, because that was a major insult. Like, that was the equivalent of someone calling you a communist in the 50s or 60s. It was you just, there was a line you don't cross, and they crossed it. There was also, or I guess in the modern era, it's really difficult to find a good modern comparison, honestly, that works and that will turn everyone off of your campaign if your opponent calls you that. Now, obviously, Jefferson won in 1800, but the point is that back then, newspapers and their endorsements, as well as the attack ads they put out against your opponent, and the promotional ads they put out for you, which were in the form of news articles, right? You want to talk about fake news? Yeah, let's talk about that. Uh, but seriously, the newspapers were extremely important, as were your campaign surrogates. So Adams would have had Alexander Hamilton campaigning for him, probably Elbridge Gerry. Um, Maybe not Elbridge Gerry. Yeah, probably not Elbridge Gerry. I'm talking about the governor of Massachusetts. He tended to not like as big a government. He was an anti-federalist, actually, if I remember correctly. So he would not, and when I say anti-federalist, I'm talking about against the ratification of the Constitution. He was the big states' rights guy. Anyway, and of course he's the guy that gerrymandering is named after, because he famously did it. But no, say Alexander Hamilton's, your DeWitt Clintons, stuff like that. And Jefferson would have had people, of course, George Washington wanted to stay out of it because George Washington considered himself an independent, even though he definitely leaned Federalist. But he did have both members of both groups, the National Republicans and the Federalists, within his cabinet. Jefferson, of course, being the famous first Secretary of State. Adams, of course, being the Vice President. Stuff like that. Of course, he did have Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury. I believe Henry Knox was the first Secretary of Defense, though it was back then it was called the War Department. So he was the Secretary of War. I'm trying to remember who the first Attorney General was, and I don't remember. It's kind of sad for somebody who prides himself on his knowledge of civics to not remember the first Attorney General, but okay, whatever. Washington didn't like partisan fights, or as he called them, factions. And to be fair to him, it's a 100% fair argument to make that factions tend to be detrimental to the health of the nation, or parties, right? So, at the end of the day, he stayed out of it. Now, Jefferson's surrogates included people like, say, Patrick Henry, who is a brilliant orator. Certainly would have included a few other figures. I'm trying to think off the top of my head because at the end of the day, it's harder to remember. He probably would have had, I believe, Rutledge from South Carolina. Yeah, he probably would have had Rutledge. He definitely had Madison. Possibly Monroe. Possibly. Jackson wasn't a figure back then. And he was probably only just old enough to vote at that point. And whether or not he owned property at that point, we'll never know. But he was going for probably a military career at this point, trying to start one, because by the time of the War of 1812, he does become a somewhat major figure in its aftermath, thanks to the Battle of New Orleans. And I'm trying to make sure people actually understand what I say when I talk about New Orleans. But yeah, so it's one of those situations where it would be a political observer, a pundit today, would have a very hard time going back then and recognizing the campaign, because your top of the ticket candidate isn't publicly accessible. But their surrogates certainly are. But their travel ban is very local, maybe only their state or even congressional district. Um, the newspapers have significant sway, and each town has two, maybe three or four, and each one has a different political bend to it. So it's not a campaign that I think a lot of people would recognize. But it is interesting because it set up the basic framework of how campaigns are run in the modern era, right? Because you have two basic styles of advertising. You have attack ads, which in 1800 that was the entire campaign was attack ads. And you have, of course, ads that were designed to promote you. Of course, these were in the form of news articles, again, sponsored content, but it does matter, right? It does matter. Then you have the concept. I mean, again, surrogates are still a thing, but they travel a lot more than they used to, especially back then. So the framework was laid. What it really needed, and by the way, this style of campaigning remained very much the same probably until the end of the era of good feeling, where things changed with Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson was a man of the people who told it like it was and wouldn't put up with crap from no one and fought the establishment and the... Yeah, I'm starting to recognize why Trump really likes Andrew Jackson. I wonder if Trump would be big into dueling, like Andrew Jackson was. Anyway, but Andrew Jackson will be the next candidate that we will look at, because he was the next candidate who really evolved the style of campaigning. And later on, we'll talk about a few other notable changes in campaigning as this series continues to progress. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. See y'all next time. Remember, likes, comments, subscriptions really do help, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you, and have a nice day.